Section 45 of A History of Our Own Times, Volume 4 by Justin McCarthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 66, The Anti-climax of Imperialism, Part 1. During the excitement caused by the preparations for the Congress of Berlin, a long career came quietly to a close. On May 28th, 1878, Lord Russell died at his residence, Pembroke Lodge, Richmond. He may be said to have faded out of life, to have ceased to live rather than to have died, so quiet, gradual, almost imperceptible was the passing away. Not many days before his death, on May 9th, a deputation of representative and distinguished nonconformists had waited upon him to present him with an address on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts, a reform of which he was the great promoter. Lord Russell was not able to receive the deputation. His wife and son spoke for him. He had not for some time taken any active part in public affairs. We have already in this book spoken of his political career as closed. Now and then some public event aroused his attention, and he addressed a letter to one of the newspapers. He wrote as a man speaks, who, sinking quietly and gradually into death, is suddenly roused to interest in the affairs of the living by catching some words of a half-whispered conversation around him, and who murmurs some sentences of faint remonstrance or advice. There was something strangely pathetic in these utterances, with their imperfect application to the actual condition of things around, and the testimony they bore to the fading man's inextinguishable interest in the progress of living history. To the last moments of his life, Lord Russell refused to surrender wholly his concern in the affairs of men. The world listened respectfully to these few occasional words from one who had borne a leader's part in some of the greatest political struggles of the century, and who still from the very edge of the grave was anxious to offer his whisper of counsel or of warning. No one felt bound to weigh too carefully the substantial and practical value of the advice, under the altered conditions of that actual time to which Lord Russell could hardly be said to belong any more. His had been, on the whole, a great career. He had not only lived through great changes, he helped to accomplish some of the greatest changes his time had known. His life was singularly unselfish. He was often eager and pushing where he believed that he saw his way to do something needful, and men confounded the zeal of a cause with the eagerness of personal ambition. He never cared for money, and his original rank raised him above any possible consideration for enhanced social distinction. He had made many mistakes, but those who knew him best prized most highly both his political capacity and his personal character. His later years were made happy and smooth by all that the love of a household could do. He had lost a son, a young man of much political promise, Lord Amberley, who died in 1876, but on the whole he had suffered less in his later time than is commonly the lot of those who live to extreme old age. The time of his death was in a certain sense appropriate. His public career had just begun at the time of the Congress of Vienna. It closed with the preparations for the Congress of Berlin. Why did not Lord Beaconsfield sacrifice to the gods his dearest possession, his political majority, immediately after the triumphal return from Berlin? The opinion of nearly all who pretended to form a judgment was that at that time the great majority of the constituents were with him. He seemed to have reached the zenith of his own power, and to have accomplished that object which is held so dear by a certain class of Englishmen, that of making the influence of England predominant over the councils of Europe. It is said that he was strongly advised by some of his northern supporters not to put the country then to the cost of a general election. Trade had been depressed for some time. The depression was due in the first instance to causes which had no concern with politics, but it had of course been made much deeper by the anxiety and uneasiness which the too enterprising policy of the government kept alive in these countries. It was therefore strongly pressed on Lord Beaconsfield that, especially in the northern counties, where he had many influential supporters, the drain caused by bad trade had been so heavy that it would be unfair to hasten a dissolution and thus impose large and at that time unnecessary cost on the constituencies. Whatever the reason may have been, the expected dissolution did not take place, and from that time Lord Beaconsfield never had any chance of a successful appeal to the country. From that time the popularity of his government began to go down and down. Many things were against them for which they were not responsible, many things for which they had made themselves distinctly responsible. The badness of trade and the general depression were no fault of theirs to begin with, but, as we have just said, they aggravated every evil of this kind by the strain on which they kept the expectation of the country. Their domestic policy had not been successful. They had attempted many large measures and failed to carry them through. They had not satisfied the country party to whom they owed so much. The malt tax remained a grievance, as it had been for generations. The government had got into trouble with the Home Rule party. Mr. Butt had been failing in physical power and in influence for some time. His place as a leader had long been practically disputed by Mr. Parnell, and was evidently about to be taken by him. Mr. Parnell, a young man who lately came into Parliament, soon proved himself the most remarkable politician who had arisen in the field of Irish politics since the day when John Mitchell was conveyed away from Dublin to Bermuda. The tactics adopted by Mr. Parnell annoyed and discredited the government. Good-natured men of respectable ability and no great force of character, like Sir Stafford Northcote, were wholly unable to cope with the pertinacity and policy of such an antagonist. The country blamed the ministry. It scarcely knew why, for the manner in which the policy called obstructive had been allowed to come into force. It was evident that a new chapter in Irish agitation was opening, and those who disliked the prospect felt inclined to lay the blame on the government, as if, because they happened to be in office, they must be responsible for everything that took place during their official reign. All these influences combined were telling against Lord Beaconsfield's administration. Perhaps had he been still in the House of Commons, and still in the possession of his full physical vigour, he might have done something to maintain the credit of his government. But in the quiet shelter of the House of Lords he could only now and then make a show speech, in which he usually succeeded in convincing the public of his entire independence and isolation from the policy and the purposes of his colleagues. Scarcely ever was a ministerial explanation of any important part of the government policy given in the House of Commons without its being followed by some explanation breathing a totally different spirit and conveyed in utterly different words from the lips of Lord Beaconsfield. In the House of Commons, Sir Stafford Northcote and Mr. Cross almost invariably endeavoured to minimise and reduce to the most practicable limits the objects of the foreign policy of the government. In the House of Lords, the Prime Minister almost invariably endeavoured to magnify his office and his mission, and to insist upon it that every step taken by him in foreign affairs was part of a great, new, ambitious, and imperial policy. Most of all, the ministry suffered from the effect produced upon the country by the smaller wars into which they had plunged. The first of these was the invasion of Afghanistan. This was part of the great imperial policy which Lord Lytton was sent to carry out in India. The government determined to send a mission to Sher Ali, one of the sons of Dost Mohammed, and then the ruler of Kabul. During the time when it was still uncertain whether England and Russia were not to be at war, the Russian government appeared to have sent an envoy of their own to Kabul, with the object, no doubt, of obtaining the direct or indirect assistance of Sher Ali. The English government determined to guard against possible danger for the future by establishing a distinct and paramount influence in Afghanistan. Sher Ali strongly objected to receive either a mission or a permanent resident. The mission was sent forward. It was so numerous as to look rather like an army than an embassy. It started from Peshawar on September 21st, 1878, but was stopped on the frontier by an officer of Sher Ali, who objected to its passing through until he had received authority from his master. This delay was magnified by the news first received here into an insolent rebuff. The unlucky performance which had been attempted in France in 1870 was by chance or error or purpose enacted over again on a small scale in England. The English envoy was made to play the part of the French ambassador, and the passion of the English people for the moment became inflamed with the idea of an insult to the English flag. The envoy was ordered to go on, and before long the mission was turned into an invasion. The Afghans made but a poor resistance, and the English troops soon occupied Kabul. Sher Ali fled from his capital. One portion of our forces occupied Kandahar. Lord Beaconsfield announced that the object of the invasion of Afghanistan was satisfactorily accomplished, that England was now in possession of the 3 great highways which connected Afghanistan with India, that he hoped the country would long remain in possession of them, and that it had secured a frontier which would render the Indian Empire invulnerable. Sher Ali died, and Yaqub Khan, his son, became his successor. Yaqub Khan presented himself at the British camp, which had been established at Gandamak, a place between Jalalabad and Kabul. Here the Treaty of Gandamak was signed on May 5th, 1879. The Indian government undertook by this treaty to pay the Amir £60,000 a year, and the Amir ceded, or appeared to cede, what Lord Beaconsfield called the scientific frontier, and agreed to admit a British representative to reside in Kabul. On those conditions he was to be supported against any foreign enemy with money and arms, and if necessary with men. Hardly had the country ceased clapping its hands and exulting over the quiet establishment of an English resident at Kabul, when a telegram arrived announcing that the events of November 1841 had repeated themselves that city. The tragedy of Sir Alexander Burnes was enacted over again. Down almost to its smallest details, that terrible drama was played once more. Only the actors were new. A popular rising took place in Kabul, exactly as had happened in 1841. Sir Louis Cavagnari, the English envoy, and all or nearly all the members of his staff were murdered. There was nothing to be done for it but to invade Kabul over again and take vengeance for the massacre of the English officers. The British troops hurried up, fought their way with their usual success, and on the Christmas Eve of 1879, Kabul was again entered. Yaqub Khan, accused of complicity in the massacre, was sent as a prisoner to India, possibly, as was then thought, to await his trial for a share in the murder. Kabul was occupied but not possessed. The English government held in their power just as much of Afghanistan as they could cover with their encampments. They held it for just so long as they kept the encampments standing. The Treaty of Gandamak was, of course, nothing but a waste of paper. The scientific frontier had not even been defined. It was to have been provided for in a supplementary document to the treaty, which was to set forth its precise line and extent. This part of the business was never accomplished, and the terms of the bond, so far as they had any real existence at all, were washed off the paper in the blood of Sir Louis Cavagnari. We got into Afghanistan. There now remained a far greater difficulty to get out of it. Blood will have blood, says Macbeth. The war in South Africa was, if possible, less justifiable. It was also, if possible, more disastrous. The region which we call South Africa consisted of several states, native and European, under various forms of authority. Cape Colony and Natal were for a long time the only English dominions. The Orange Free State and the Transvaal Republic were Dutch settlements. In 1848 the British government had established its authority over the Orange River Territory, but it afterwards transferred its powers to a provisional government of Dutch origin. The Transvaal was a Dutch republic with which we had until quite lately no direct connection. In 1852 the English government resolved that its operations and its responsibilities in South Africa should be limited to Cape Colony and Natal, and distinctly recognized the independence of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal Republic. Besides these states of what we may call European origin, there were a great many native communities, some of which had enough of organization to be almost regarded as states. The Kaffirs, as we all know, had often given us trouble before. The supposed insurrection of Langa Libalali had been suppressed in 1874 with great severity, and Langa Libalali had himself been captured, tried, and imprisoned. The most universal opinion of independent observers was that Langa Libalali had not intended insurrection, and that he had been unfairly and unjustly dealt with. It is important to mention the fact here, because there can be no doubt that the treatment of Langa Libalali had considerable influence on the minds of others of the native chiefs. The most powerful tribe in South Africa was that of the Zulus. Natal was divided from Zulu territory only by the river Tugela. The ruler of the Zulu tribe, Cetshwayo, owed his throne to a great victory which he obtained over his brother, who was killed in the battle along with some 3,000 of his adherents. Cetshwayo was much inclined to a cordial alliance with the English, and was anxious to receive his crown as a kind of gift at our hands. Although he did not owe his power in any direct sense to us, yet he went through a form in which our representatives bore their part of accepting his crown at the hands of the English sovereign. He was often involved in disputes with the Boers or Dutch-descended occupants of the Transvaal Republic. Other native tribes were still more directly and often engaged in quarrels with the Boers. The Transvaal Republic made war upon one of the greatest of these African chiefs, Sekokuni, and had the worst of it in the struggle. The Republic was badly managed in every way. Its military operations were a total failure. Its exchequer was ruined. There seemed hardly any chance of maintaining order within its frontier, and the prospect appeared at the time to be that its South African enemies would overrun the whole of the Republic, would thus come up to the borders of the English states, and possibly might soon involve the English settlers themselves in war. Under these conditions, a certain number of disappointed or alarmed inhabitants of the Transvaal made some kind of indirect proposition to England that the Republic should be annexed to English territory. Sir Theophilus Shepstone was sent out by England to ascertain whether this offer was genuine and national. He seems to have been entirely mistaken in his appreciation of the condition of things. Acting under the impression that the Boers were willing to accept English authority, he boldly, one might say lawlessly, declared the Republic a portion of the dominions of Great Britain. Meanwhile, there had been a dispute going on for a long time between Cetshwayo, the Zulu king, and the Transvaal Republic about a certain disputed strip of land. The dispute was referred to the arbitration of England, with whom Cetshwayo was then on the most friendly terms. 4 English arbitrators decided that the disputed strip of territory properly belonged to the Zulu nation. End of section 45. Section 46 of A History of Our Own Times, Volume 4, by Justin McCarthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 66, The Anti-climax of Imperialism, Part 2. Meanwhile, Sir Bartle Frere was sent out as Lord High Commissioner. From the moment of his appearance on the scene, the whole state of affairs seems to have undergone a complete change. Sir Bartle Frere kept back the award of the arbitrators for several months, unwilling to hand over any new territory unconditionally to Cetsueo, whom he regarded as a dangerous enemy and an unscrupulous despot. During this time a hostile feeling was growing up in the mind of Cetsueo. It was not mere enmity. It was chiefly a fear that some treachery was being planned against him. He could not but see that a total change had taken place in the demeanour of the English representatives since the occupation of the Transvaal. He had constantly before his mind the fate of Langali-Balali. He appears to have really become mastered by the conviction that the English were determined to find a pretext for making war on him, for annexing his territory, and for sending him to prison, as had been done with Langali-Balali. When such a feeling as this exists on one side or the other, it is easy to imagine that cause of complaint must soon arise. On the English side there was an inclination to regard as offensive preparations which Cetsueo insisted he meant purely as measures of defence. Sir Bartle Frere was a man who had many times rendered great service to England. He had been Chief Commissioner in Sind from 1852 to 1859, and had shown great ability and energy during the Indian Mutiny. Since that, he had been one of the Council of the Viceroy of India. He had been for some years Governor of Bombay, and he had been appointed to the Council of the Secretary of State here at home. He had been sent upon an important mission to the Sultan of Zanzibar in 1872, the object of which was to endeavour to obtain the suppression of the slave trade, and he succeeded. The Sultan entered into a treaty for the putting down of the trade, and coming to London in 1875 was the small Fulvus Leo, or tawny lion, of a season. Sir Bartle Frere seems to have been really filled with that imperial instinct about which other men only talked. He seems to have had in him something of the Cromwell, combined perhaps with a good deal of the William Penn. His was a strong nature with an imperious will and an inexhaustible energy. He was undoubtedly conscientious and high-principled according to his lights. Given a great field of action, it is possible that he might have made a deep mark upon the history of his time. The fortune which lately confined his energies to South Africa turned almost into the ridiculous what might under more favourable conditions have been the sublime. He appears to have been influenced by two strong ambitions: to spread the gospel and to extend the territory of England. It is said that in Asia he saw little opportunity for promulgating Christianity, and that he yearned for Africa as a more promising scene for such a labour. In Africa his mind appears to have become at once possessed with the conviction that, alike for the safety of the whites and the improvement of the coloured races, it would be necessary to extend the government of England over the whole southern portion of that continent, and to efface the boundaries of native tribes by blending them all into one imperial confederation. Cetsueo seems to have had considerable military ability and a certain degree of political intelligence. His position made him a rival to Sir Bartle Frere's policy, and Sir Bartle Frere appears to have made up his mind that these two stars were not to keep their motion in one sphere, and that South Africa was not to brook the double rule of the English commissioner and the Zulu king. Sir Bartle Frere kept the award of the 4 English arbitrators in his hands for some months without taking any action upon it, and when he did at length announce it to Cetsueo, he accompanied it with an ultimatum declaring that the Zulu army must at once be disbanded and must return to their homes. This was in point of fact a declaration of war. The English troops immediately invaded the Zulu country, and almost the first news that reached England of the progress of the war was the story of the complete and terrible defeat of an English force on January 22nd, 1879. Not within the memory of any living man had so sudden and complete a disaster fallen upon English arms. Englishmen were wholly unused to the very idea of English troops being defeated in the field. The story that an English force had been surprised, outgeneraled, outfought, completely defeated by half-naked savages, came on the country with a shock never felt since at least the time of the disasters of Cabul and the Jugdulluk Pass. Of course, the disaster was retrieved. Lord Chelmsford, the commander-in-chief, son of the Lord Chelmsford just dead, who had been twice Lord Chancellor, only wanted time, in homely language, to pull himself together in order to recover his position. The war soon came to an end, which everyone must have expected. First the defeat of the Zulu king, and then his capture. One melancholy incident made the war memorable not only to England but to Europe. The young French Prince Louis Napoleon, who had studied in English military schools, felt a strong desire to vary the somewhat mournful monotony of his life by taking part in the campaign. He was influenced in some measure by a desire to fight under the English flag, but it must be owned that he was influenced much more strongly by a wish to play to a French popular audience. He persuaded himself that it would greatly increase his chances of recovering the throne of France if he could exhibit himself to the eyes of the French public as a bold and brilliant young soldier. He therefore seized the opportunity of the Zulu campaign to offer his services and attach himself as a volunteer to Lord Chelmsford's staff. During one of the episodes of the war, he and some of his companions were surprised by a body of Zulus. Others escaped, but Prince Louis Napoleon was killed. The news of his death created a great shock in England. Everyone was sorry for the young gallant life so uselessly thrown away. Still more deep was the regret felt for the position of the bereaved mother. Hardly has any history a tale more tragic than hers. So sudden and splendid an elevation, so brilliant a career, so complete a fall, such an accumulation of sorrow is hardly equalled even in the story of Marie Antoinette. Now, in the autumn of her life, she was left absolutely alone. Youth, beauty, imperial throne, husband, son, all were gone. It was natural that considerations such as these should throw a halo of melancholy romance around the fate of young Prince Louis Napoleon, and should rouse in this country an amount of sympathy which harsher critics condemned as sentimental and even as maudlin. It must be admitted that the poor young prince fell in a quarrel which was not his, in which he had neither right nor duty to interfere, and which he had taken on himself with a purely personal and political motive. Princes in exile have many times borne arms in quarrels not their own. It is one of the privileges and one of the consolations of exile thus to be enabled to lend a helping hand to a foreign cause. But then the cause must be great and just. It must have some noble principle to inspire it. When the Orleanist princes fought under the flag of the United States, they were contending for a principle dear to the lovers of freedom in every country in the world, a principle which it is the part of a Frenchman as well as an American to sustain. But the Zulu War was not in any sense a war of principle. It was not even a national English war. It was not a war with which the English people had any sympathy whatever. It was not even a war of which the English government approved. For it is a strange peculiarity of this chapter of our history that the policy of Sir Bartle Frere and the war in Zululand were condemned by no one more strongly than by the members of Her Majesty's government in England. The dispatches sent out to Sir Bartle Frere were constantly dispatches of remonstrance and complaint, even of condemnation. When Prince Louis Napoleon, therefore, thrust himself into this quarrel, he withdrew himself from any just claim to general sympathy. Regret for the sudden extinction of a young life of promise was but natural, and that regret was freely given. But the verdict of the public remained unaltered. He had thrown away his life uselessly in a quarrel which brought no honour, and for a motive which was not unselfish and was not exalted. Cetsueo was captured and sent into imprisonment. His territory was divided amongst the leading native chiefs. A portion of it was given to an Englishman, John Donne, who had settled in the country very young, and who had become a sort of potentate among the Zulus. Sekosini, another South African chief, was also conquered and captured, and order in a certain sense might be said to reign in South Africa once more. Nothing, however, that the government had done was so unfortunate for them in popular estimation as the official sanction they were compelled to give to the policy of Sir Bartle Frere. The war, although it had ended in a practical success, was none the less regarded by the English public as a blunder and a disaster. The loss of English life had been terrible, and worse than the mere loss of life was the fact that lives had been thrown away to no purpose. Hardly in any part of the country or amongst any class of politicians was there the least sympathy felt with the policy which had made the war. Quiet onlookers began to feel that now at last the imperialistic principle had reached its anti-climax, that the Elizabethan revival was turned into a burlesque. Even the Afghan enterprise, objectionable though it was in almost every way, did not affect the popularity of the government so much as the Zulu War. The plain common sense of England held that Sir Bartle Frere, however high and conscientious his motives may have been, was in the wrong from first to last, and that the cause of Cetsueo was on the whole a cause of fairness and of justice. The whole quarrel was so small, so miserable, that no pulse even of imperialistic veins could stir with any exultation at the tidings of supposed success. It seemed ignoble work for English soldiers to be engaged in a war against a simple savage like the Zulu king, nor did anyone feel the least assurance that a permanent peace had been obtained for Southern Africa, even at the cost of all this shame and blood. The Transvaal difficulty remained still unsettled. The native tribes might at any time or any chance coalesce in force sufficient to oppose us. We were threatened everywhere with fresh and useless responsibilities. We had now an African question as well as an Eastern question. Even the music halls of London rang with no plaudits to songs in praise of the South African campaign. England had gone into the war against her conscience. She had come out of it, not triumphant, but regretful and ashamed, a victor that hath lost in gain. The attitude of the government seemed one of mere penitence. Cetsueo in his prison looked a much more respectable figure for history than the minister whose unfortunate task it was to defend the policy which he had never approved, but which he had not strength of mind enough firmly to resist at the beginning. On the government fell the burden of Sir Bartle Frere's responsibilities. Without Sir Bartle Frere's consoling and self-sufficing belief in the justice of his cause and the genuineness of his enterprise. The distress in the country was growing deeper and deeper day by day. Some of the most important trades were suffering heavily. The winter of 1878 had been long and bitter, and there had been practically no summer. The manufacturing and mining districts almost everywhere over the country were borne down by the failure of business. The working classes were in genuine distress. In Ireland there was a forecast of something almost approaching to famine. When distress affects the trade and the population of a country, the first impulse is always to find fault with the reigning government. Lord Beaconsfield's supporters many times asked in anger and scorn whether Her Majesty's ministers were responsible for the bad weather. The answer which most people gave, either in words or in thought, was sound in its general logic. Her Majesty's ministers, they said, are not responsible for the seasons, but they are responsible for a policy which adds to bad seasons the burden of unnecessary wars. The authority of the government in the House of Commons was greatly shaken. Sir Stafford Northcote had not the strength necessary to make a successful leader. Like most men who want natural firmness, he occasionally put forth little efforts of a sort of petulant determination. He generally tried to be strong where he should have been yielding, and was almost invariably compelled to be yielding where he ought to have been strong. The result was that the House of Commons was becoming demoralized. The government brought in a scheme for university education in Ireland, which was nothing better than a mutilation of Mr. Gladstone's rejected bill. It was carried through both houses in a few weeks because the government were anxious to do something which might have the appearance of conciliating the Irish people without going far enough in that direction to estrange their Conservative supporters. The measure thus devised had exactly the opposite effect from that which was intended. It estranged a good many Conservative supporters, it roused a new feeling of hostility amongst the Nonconformists, and it did not concede enough to the demands of the Irish Catholics to be of any use in the way of conciliation. It was plain that the mandate, to use a French phrase, of the Parliament was nearly out. The session of 1879 was its 6th session. It would only be possible to have one session more. Louder and louder grew the cry from the Liberal side for the government at once to go to the country. An argument more ingenious than substantial was got up to show that a government is bound to dissolve before the legal mandate of the Parliament has run out. Mr. Gladstone in especial endeavoured to prove that there ought always to be a kind of spare session left, a reserve session which the government might use if they were driven by actual necessity, but which as a rule should not be turned to any account. In other words, Mr. Gladstone contended that if 7 years be the legal mandate of a Parliament, it should be an understood principle that a dissolution should not be put off longer than the close of the 6th session. There seems nothing particularly satisfactory in the argument. It is reasonable to contend that the term of 7 years is too long for the duration of a Parliament. There is much to be said in favour of compelling members to meet their constituents more often than once in 7 years. The fact is that no Parliament ever does last 7 years. It might be convenient and just to declare by legislation that its tenure shall be only for 6, for 5, or even for 3 years, but it certainly seems clear that whatever be the legal term of a Parliament, it ought to be considered fairly within the right of a government not to dissolve before the expiration of the full time, if no occasion should arise to call for a prompter dissolution. In this particular instance, however, the persistency with which the government clung to their place began to look as if they were afraid to meet the challenge of the Liberals. The more they held back, the more loudly and vehemently was the challenge repeated. Many Liberals who declared that all they wanted was to meet the government at the hustings at once were probably in their hearts somewhat afraid of the result of the encounter. But as Mr. Gladstone had again and again challenged the government to appeal to the country, all his followers, and some who would not have followed him if they could have helped it, were compelled to assume the appearance of an eagerness and courage equal to his, and to echo in notes as little faltering as they could make them his call of defiance to Lord Beaconsfield. Thus the winter passed on. 2 or 3 elections which occurred meantime resulted in favour of the Conservatives. Constituencies became divided into unexpected sections or factions. In one remarkable case, that of the Southwark election, very little interest apparently was taken by the Liberals. The candidate they put forward was not a man to excite enthusiasm or even interest. The Conservative candidate, Mr. Clarke, was a man of ability, character, and influence, and the result was a remarkable victory for the Conservative side. About this time, then, there was a little renewal of confidence among the friends of Lord Beaconsfield, and a sudden sinking of the spirits among most of the Liberals. Parliament met in February, and the government gave it to be understood that they intended to have what one of them called a fair working session. Suddenly, however, they made up their minds that it would be convenient to accept Mr. Gladstone's challenge and to dissolve in the Easter holidays. The dissolution took place on March 24th, 1880, and the elections began. The result cannot be better described than in the words of Lord Beaconsfield himself in the celebrated speech which depicted a sudden breakdown of the Liberal party in an attack upon Lord Derby's government. We have quoted the words before in the place to which they properly belong, but they will bear repetition in their new application here. Only one word needs to be changed. We put in ministerial, where Lord Beaconsfield said opposition. It was like a convulsion of nature rather than any ordinary transaction of human life. I can only liken it to one of those earthquakes which take place in Calabria or Peru. There was a rumbling murmur, a groan, a shriek, a sound of distant thunder. There was a rent, a fissure in the ground, and then a village disappeared. Then a tall tower toppled down, and the whole of the ministerial benches became one great dissolving view of anarchy. For with the very first day of the elections it was evident that the Conservative majority was already gone. Each succeeding day showed more and more the change that had taken place in public feeling. Defeat was turned into disaster. Disaster became utter rout and confusion. When the elections were over, it was found that the Conservative party was nowhere. A majority of some 120 sent the Liberals back into power. No Liberal statesmen in our time ever before saw themselves sustained by such an army of followers. There was a moment or two of hesitation, of delay. The Queen sent for Lord Hartington. She then sent for Lord Granville. But everyone knew in advance who was to come into power at last. The strife lately carried on had been the old duel between two great men. Mr. Gladstone had stood up against Lord Beaconsfield for some years and fought him alone. He had dragged his party after him into many a danger. He had compelled them more than once to fight where many of them would fain have held back, and where none of them saw any chance of victory. Now at last the battle had been given to his hands, and it was a matter of necessity that the triumph should bring back to power the man whose energy and eloquence had inspired the struggle. The Queen sent for Mr. Gladstone, and a new chapter of English history opened, with the opening of which this work has to close. End of section 46. Section 47 of A History of Our Own Times, Volume 4, by Justin McCarthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 67. The Literature of the Reign, Second Survey, Part 1. The later period which we have now to survey is more rich in scientific literature than that former period which we assume to close with the Crimean War. In practical science, we have already shown the advance made during the reign of Queen Victoria has been greater in many ways than the advance made from the beginning of civilization to that time. Sir Robert Peel travelled from Rome to London to assume office as Prime Minister, exactly as Constantine travelled from York to Rome to become Emperor. Each traveller had all that sails and horses could do for him and no more. A few years later, Peel might have reached London from Rome in some 48 hours. Something of the same kind may be said for economical, political, and what is now called social science. The whole of that system of legislative reform which is founded on a recognition of the principles of humanity may be said to belong to our own times. Our penal systems have undergone a thorough reform. More than once it seemed as if the reform were going too far, and as if the tenderness to criminals were likely to prove an encouragement to crime. But although there have been for this reason little outbursts of reaction every now and then, the growth of the principle of humanity has been steady, and the principle has taken firm and fixed root in our system of penal legislation. Flogging in the army and navy may be said to be now wholly abolished. The senseless and barbarous system of imprisonment for debt is abandoned. There is no more transportation of convicts. Care is taken of the lives and the health of women and children in all manner of employments. Schools are managed on systems of wise gentleness. Do the Boys' Hall would be an impossible picture even for caricature in these later years. We are perhaps at the beginning of a movement of legislation which is about to try to the very utmost that right of state interference with individual action which at one time it was the object of most of our legislators to reduce to its very narrowest proportions. It may be that this straining of the right of the majority over the minority is destined to bring about in due course its reaction. But we do not think that the survival of the fittest, the doctrine on which our forefathers acted more or less consciously in the education of children and the treatment of criminals, will ever again, within any time to which speculation can safely reach, be adopted as a principle of our legislation. Much of the healthier and more humane spirit prevailing in our social systems, in our criminal laws, in the management of our schools, in the care of the state for the working classes, for women, and for children, is undoubtedly due to the spread of that sound and practical scientific teaching which began to make it known everywhere that the recognition of the laws of health will always be found in the end to be a recognition of the laws of morality. But though the philosophy of these later days has proved itself thus essentially practical, it is to be observed that the great scientific controversy of the time is distinctly and purely speculative. The Darwinian theory, as it is commonly, we will not say vulgarly called, may be described as one of the most remarkable facts in the history of its time. Dr. Charles R. Darwin, grandson of the author of the Botanic Garden and Zoonomia, was born in 1809. He showed at an early age great capacity as a naturalist. He accompanied as naturalist the expedition of His Majesty's ship Beagle for the survey of South America and the circumnavigation of the globe. This expedition occupied him nearly 5 years, and he returned to England in 1836. He published several studies in geology and in fossil species, and seemed to have made his mark as a naturalist of distinction and nothing more. Charles Knight's English Cyclopedia, published in 1855, 20 years after the return of Dr. Darwin from his great voyage, speaks in high terms of his contributions to the sciences he studied, and adds, "Mr. Darwin is still in the prime of life, and may therefore be expected to contribute largely to the extension of the sciences he has so successfully cultivated." If Mr. Darwin had died soon after that time, the world would never have suspected that it had lost anything more than a highly promising naturalist. In 1859 appeared The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle of Life. The book had hardly been published when it was found that a great crisis had been reached in the history of science and of thought. The publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, regarded as a mere historical fact, is of at least as much importance to the world as Comte's publication of his theory of historical development. In these pages we are considering Darwin's theory and his work merely as historical facts. We are dealing with them as we might deal with the fall of a dynasty or the birth of a new state. The controversy which broke out when The Origin of Species was published has been going on ever since, without the slightest sign of diminishing ardor. It spread almost through all society. It was heard from the pulpit and from the platform. It raged in the scientific and unscientific magazines. It was trumpeted in the newspapers. It made one of the stock subjects of talk in the dining room and the smoking room. It tittered over the tea table. Mr. Darwin's central idea was that the various species of plants and animals, instead of being each specially created and immutable, are continually undergoing modification and change through a process of adaptation, by virtue of which such varieties of the species as are in any way better fitted for the rough work of the struggle for existence are enabled to survive and multiply at the expense of the others. Mr. Darwin considers this principle, with indeed some other and less important causes, capable of explaining the manner in which all existing types may have descended from one or a very few low forms of life. All animals, beasts, birds, reptiles, insects have descended, he contends, from a very limited number of progenitors, and he holds that analogy points to the belief that all animals and plants whatever have descended from one common prototype. The idea that man gradually developed from some very low prototype was, of course, not Dr. Darwin's especially, nor belonging even to Dr. Darwin's time. It was an idea that had been floating about the world almost at all times. It had become somewhat fashionable in England not long before Dr. Darwin published his Origin of Species. It was led up to in the Vestiges of Creation, a book that once caused much stir in scientific and religious circles. A strong-minded lady in Lord Beaconsfield's Tancred bewilders and saddens the young hero by gravely informing him that we once were fishes and shall probably in the end be crows. But Darwin's book, if we take it as resting for its central point of doctrine upon that principle of the survival of the fittest, was the first great systematized attempt to give the theory a solid place among the scientific opinions of the world. It was worked out with the most minute and elaborate care, and with an inexhaustible patience, qualities which we do not expect to find in the originators of new and startling theories. Dr. Darwin's work was fiercely assailed and passionately championed. It was not the scientific principle which inflamed so much commotion. It was the supposed bearing of the doctrines on revealed religion. Injustice was done to the calm examination of Darwin's theory on both sides of the controversy. Many who really had not yet given themselves time even to consider its arguments cried out in admiration of the book, merely because they assumed that it was destined to deal a blow to the faith in revealed religion. On the other side, many of the believers in revealed religion were much too easily alarmed and too sensitive. Many of them did not pause to ask themselves whether, if every article of the doctrine were proved to be scientifically true, it would affect in the slightest degree the basis of their religious faith. To this writer it seems clear that Dr. Darwin's theory might be accepted by the most orthodox believer without the firmness of his faith molting a feather. The theory is one altogether as to the process of growth and construction in the universe, and whether accurate or inaccurate does not seem in any wise to touch the question which is concerned with the sources of all life, movement, and being. However that may be, it is certain that the book made an era, not only in science, but in scientific controversy, and not merely in scientific controversy, but in controversy expanding into all circles and amongst all intelligences. The scholar and the fribble, the divine and the schoolgirl, still talk and argue and wrangle over Darwin and the Origin of Species. Professor Huxley is one of the most distinguished and thoroughgoing supporters of Mr. Darwin's principle. Professor Huxley advocates, in his own words, the hypothesis, which supposes that species living at any time must be the result of a gradual modification of pre-existing species. He maintains that to suppose each species of plant or animal to have been formed and placed on the globe at long intervals by a distinct act of creative power is an assumption as unsupported by tradition or revelation as it is opposed to the general analogy of nature. Professor Huxley would have been a distinguished scientific man if he had never taken any part in the Darwin controversy. He would have been a distinguished scientific man, even if he had not been, as he is, a great thinker and writer. In the arena of public controversy he has long been a familiar and formidable figure. He came into the field at first almost unknown, like the disinherited knight in Scott's romance, and while the good-natured spectators were urging him to turn the blunt end of the lance against the shield of the least formidable opponent, he dashed with splendid recklessness and with spear-point forward against the buckler of Richard Owen himself, then the most renowned of England's living naturalists. Professor Huxley has a happy gift of shrewd sense and sarcasm combined. Few men can expose a sophism so effectively in a single sentence of exhaustive satire. It would be wrong to regard him merely as a scientific man. He is a literary man as well. What he writes would be worth reading for its form and its expression alone, were it of no scientific authority. He has a fascinating style and a happy way of pressing into the service of strictly scientific exposition some illustration caught from literature and art, even from popular and light literature. Mr. Huxley seemed from the first to understand that a scientific school can never become really powerful while it is content with the ear of strictly scientific men. He cultivated, therefore, sedulously and successfully, the literary art of expression. His style as a lecturer has a special charm. It is free from all effort at rhetorical eloquence, but it has all the eloquence which is born of the union of deep thought with simple expression and luminous diction. There is not much of the poetic about Mr. Huxley's style, but the occasional vividness of his illustrations suggests the existence of some of the higher imaginative qualities. There was something like a gleam of the poetic in the half-melancholy, half-humorous introduction of Balzac's famous Peau de Chagrin into the well-known Protoplasm lecture. But, as a rule, Mr. Huxley treads only the firm earth, and deliberately, perhaps scornfully, rejects any aspirings after the clouds. End of section 47. Section 48 of A History of Our Own Times, Volume 4, by Justin McCarthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 67, The Literature of the Reign, Second Survey, Part 2. Professor Tyndall, another great teacher in the same school, has, like Mr. Huxley, the gift of literary expression, informed perhaps by more of the imaginative and the poetic. Mr. Tyndall has done perhaps more practical work in science than Mr. Huxley. He has written more, he has sometimes written more eloquently. But there is a certain coarseness of materialism about Mr. Tyndall's views with regard to man and nature. There is a vehement aggressiveness in him which must interfere with the clearness of his views. He has occasionally assailed the orthodox with the polemical intemperance of a field preacher. He has more than once been carried clear away from his purpose by the unsparing vigor of his controversial style. He is sometimes one of the most impatient of sages, the most intolerant of philosophers. His temper as a controversialist may have tended sometimes to weaken his scientific authority, but of course this only happens where the subject engrossing Professor Tyndall's attention is one of that class which have in all ages proved too exciting now and then for the cool judgment even of philosophers. Mr. Tyndall has made noble contributions to scientific literature which concern in no wise the tremendous questions put by Mr. Carlyle with such solemnity and such emotion. Whence, and, O heavens, whither? Mr. Herbert Spencer may be said to have taken the sphere of the naturalist and the spheres of the metaphysician and the psychologist, and drawn a circle round, embracing and enfolding them all, and adopting them as his province. If Mr. Darwin's attempt to map out the process by which vegetable and animal life are gradually constructed was an ambitious effort, The task which Mr. Herbert Spencer undertook was of still more vast and venturous scope. Mr. Spencer is the author of a series of connected philosophical works intended to reduce to harmonious and scientific order the principles of biology, psychology, sociology, and morality. He has applied universally and carried out in systematic detail the doctrine of evolution or development. In 1855 appeared his Principles of Psychology, an attempt to analyze the relations between the order of the worlds of matter and of mind. The central and governing idea of this work is that the universal law of intelligence flows directly from the cooperation of mind and nature in the creation of our ideas. As there is a persistency in the order of events in nature, so will there be a persistency in the connection between the corresponding states of consciousness. The succession or coexistence of external phenomena produces a like succession in our mental perceptions, and when any two psychical states often occur together, there is at length established an internal tendency for those states always to recur in the same order. Starting from the law which has been thus described in words that are not ours, Mr. Spencer traces the growth of human intelligence from the lower phenomena of reflex action and instinct, and then shows how our unconscious life merges in a succession of conscious phenomena. And lastly, he endeavors to carry us upwards from the origin of memory to the highest exercise of reason and the scientific development of the moral feelings. In other words, Mr. Spencer endeavors to lay down the principles of development for the whole world of matter, of mind, and of morals. Mr. Spencer has written essays on education, on the government of states, and on other subjects which, however, scarcely seem to be marked by the precision of thought which distinguishes him as a psychological writer. His views of education and of civic government seem occasionally to degenerate almost to the degree of crotchets. His style is not fascinating. It is clear, strong, and simple, but it has little literary beauty, and borrows little from illustration of any kind. Mr. Spencer himself utterly undervalues what he regards as superfluous words. Attractiveness of style is part of the instrumentality by which a great writer or speaker accomplishes his ends. If a man would convince, he must not disdain the arts by which people can be induced to listen. Much of Mr. Spencer's greatest work had long been little better than a calling aloud to solitude for the lack of the attractiveness of style which he despises, but which Plato or Aristotle would not have despised. Mr. Spencer, however, rather prides himself on not caring much about the Greeks and their literature. A great thinker he undoubtedly is, one of the greatest thinkers of modern time, perhaps a man to be classed among the few great and original philosophers of all time. It is only of late years that his fame has begun to spread among his countrymen. Gradually it has become known to the English public in general that there was among them a great lonely thinker, surveying the problems of mind and matter as from some high serene watchtower. His works were well known among reading people in the United States, long before they had ceased to be the exclusive property of a very select few in England. Of late he has come to be, in a certain sense, the fashion in this country among people who desire to be thought clever. It is not any part of our purpose to raise the question whether less honour is done to a great writer by neglecting him altogether, or by adopting him as one of the authors whom it is conventionally proper to have read, and with whom, therefore, everybody is bound to affect an acquaintance. It certainly was not for that Mr. Spencer toiled his way over the rugged, unpitying Alpine heights of thought, ut pueris, we may add, puellisque placeat et declamatio fiat. The name of Professor Max Müller is now by common consent enrolled with the names of famous Englishmen. Max Müller has adopted England as his home, and England has quietly annexed his reputation. He has approached the history of man's development by the study of man's speech. He has opened a new and a most important road for the student. In his hands philology ceases to be a dry science of words and becomes quickened into a living teacher of history. Max Müller has contributed to various departments of thought, and has proved himself a charming writer who can invest even the least attractive subject with an absorbing interest. Metaphysical and psychological science have lately lost a pupil of marvellous versatility in George Henry Lewis. No literary man in our time did so many different things, and did them so well as Mr. Lewis. He wrote novels. He made some of the most successful adaptations from the French theatre known to our stage. He was an accomplished literary and dramatic critic. He translated Spinoza. He wrote the lives of Goethe and Robespierre. He produced a history of philosophy in which he had something of his own to say about every great philosopher from Thales down to Schelling and Kant. He was the author of all manner of physiological essays. His Problems of Life and Mind and his Physical Basis of Mind were really contributions of permanent value to the studies with which they so boldly dealt. It is not perhaps unworthy of notice that Mr. Lewis was even a remarkably good amateur actor. It seemed as if he must be able to do everything well to which it pleased him to put his hand. His peculiar merit was not, however, that he could write clever books on a great variety of subjects. London has many hack writers who could go to work at any publisher's order and produce successively an epic poem, a novel, a treatise on the philosophy of the conditioned, a handbook of astronomy, a farce, a life of Julius Caesar, an account of African explorations, and a volume of sermons. But none of these productions would have one gleam of native and genuine vitality about it. The moment it had served its purpose in the literary market, it would go dead down to the dead. Lewis's works are of quite a different style. They have positive merit and value of their own, and they live. It was a characteristically audacious thing to attempt to cram the history of philosophy into a couple of medium-sized volumes, polishing off each philosopher in a few pages, draining him, plucking out the heart of his mystery and his system, and stowing him away in the glass jar designed to exhibit him to an edified class of students. But it must be admitted that the history of philosophy is a genuine and a valuable study, although the author, not then in the calmer maturity of his powers, crumples up the whole science of metaphysics, sweeps away transcendental philosophy, and demolishes a priori reasoning in a manner which strongly reminds one of Arthur Pendennis, upsetting in a dashing criticism, and on the faith of an hour's reading in an encyclopaedia, some great scientific theory of which he had never heard before, and the development of which had been the life's labour of a sage. The period which we are surveying was especially rich in historical studies. It was prolific not only in historians and histories, but even in new ways of studying history. The Crimean War was still going on when Mr. Froude's History of England from the fall of Wolsey to the death of Elizabeth began to make its appearance, and the public soon became alive to the fact that a man of great and original power had come into literature. The first volume of Mr. Buckle's History of Civilization was published in 1857. Mr. Freeman literally disentombed a great part of the early history of England, cleared it of the accumulated dust of traditional error and ignorance, and for the first time showed it to us as it must have presented itself to the eyes of those who helped to make it. Mr. Kinglake began the story of the Crimean War. Mr. Lecky occupied himself with the history of rationalism in Europe, the history of European morals from Augustus to Charlemagne, and more lately with the great days of the 18th century. Canon Stubbs made the constitutional history of England his province, and Mr. Green undertook to compress the whole sequence of English history into a sort of literary outline map, in which events stood clearly out in the just perspective and proportions of their real importance. Of the men we have named, it would not be unreasonable to say that Mr. Froude and Mr. Kinglake belonged to the romantic school of historian, Mr. Buckle and Mr. Lecky to the philosophic, Mr. Freeman, Canon Stubbs, and Mr. Green to the practical and the real. To show events and people as they were is the clear aim of this latter school. To picture them dramatically and vividly would seem to be the ambition of Mr. Froude and Mr. Kinglake. To show that they have a system and a sequence and are evidence of great natural laws is the object of men like Mr. Buckle and Mr. Lecky. Mr. Froude is probably the most popular historian since Macaulay, although his popularity is far indeed from that of Macaulay. He is widely read, where Mr. Freeman would seem intolerably learned and pedantic, and Mr. Lecky too philosophic to be lively. His books have been the subject of the keenest controversy. His picture of Henry VIII set all the world wondering. It set an example and became a precedent. It founded a new school in history and biography, what we may call the paradoxical school, the school which sets itself to discover that some great man had all the qualities for which the world had never before given him credit, and none of those which it had always been content to recognize as his undoubted possession. The virtues of the misprized Tiberius, the purity and meekness of Lucrezia Borgia, the disinterestedness and forbearance of Charles of Burgundy, these and other such historical discoveries naturally followed Mr. Froude's illustration of the domestic virtues, the exalted chastity, and the merciful disposition of Henry VIII. Mr. Froude has, however, qualities which raise him high above the level of the ordinary paradoxical historian. He has a genuine creative power. We may refuse to believe that his Henry VIII is the Henry VIII of history, but we cannot deny that Mr. Froude makes us see Henry as vividly as if he stood in life before us. A dangerous gift for a historian, but it helps to make a great literary man. Mr. Froude may claim to be regarded as a great literary man, measured by the standard of our time. He has imagination. He has that sympathetic and dramatic instinct which enables a man to enter into the emotions and motives, the likings and dislikings of people of a past age. His style is penetrating and thrilling. His language often rises to the dignity of poetic eloquence. The figures he conjures up are always the resemblances of real men and women. They are never waxwork, or lay figures, or skeletons clothed in words, or purple rags of description stuffed out with straw into an awkward likeness of the human form. The one distinct impression we carry away from Mr. Froude's history is that of the living reality of his figures. In Marlowe's Faustus, the doctor conjures up for the amusement of the emperor a procession of beautiful and stately shadows to represent the great ones of the past. When the apparitions of Alexander the Great and his favourite pass by, the emperor can hardly restrain himself from rushing to clasp the hero in his arms, and has to be reminded by the wizard that these are but shadows, not substantial. Even then the emperor can hardly get over his impression of their reality, for he cries, "I have heard it said that this fair lady, whilst she lived on earth, had on her neck a little wart or mole, and lo, there is the mark on the neck of the beautiful form which floats across his field of vision." Mr. Froude's shadows are like this, so deceptive, so seemingly vital and real, with the beauty and the blot alike conspicuous, with the pride and passion of the hero and the heroine's white neck and the wart on it. Mr. Froude's whole soul, in fact, is in the human beings whom he meets as he unfolds his narrative. He is a romantic or heroic portrait painter. He has painted some pictures which may almost compare with those of Titian. Their glances follow and haunt one like the wonderful eyes of Cesare Borgia, or the soul-piercing resignation of that face on Guido's canvas, once believed to be that of Beatrice Cenci. But Mr. Froude wants the one indispensable quality of the true historian: accuracy. He wants altogether the cold, patient, stern quality which clings to facts, the scientific faculty. His narrative never stands out in that dry light which Bacon so commends, the light of undistorted and clear truth. The temptations to a man with the gift of heroic portrait painting are too great for Mr. Froude. His genius carries him away and becomes his master. When Titian was painting his Cesare Borgia, is it not conceivable that his imagination may have been positively inflamed by the contrast between the man's physical beauty and moral guilt, and have unconsciously heightened the contrast by making the pride and passion lower more darkly, the superb brilliancy of the eyes burn more radiantly than might have been seen in real life? Mr. Froude has evidently been often thus ensnared by his own special gift. There is hardly anything in our modern literature more powerful, picturesque, and dramatic than his portrait of Mary Queen of Scots. It stands out and glows and darkens, with all the glare and gloom of a living form, now in sun and now in shadow. It is almost as perfect and impressive as Titian. But no reasonable person can doubt that it is a dramatic and not an historical study. Without going into any controversy as to disputed facts, even admitting for the sake of argument that Mary was as guilty as Mr. Froude would make her, it is impossible to believe that the woman he has painted is the Mary Stuart of history and of life. No doubt his Mary is now a reality for us. We are distinctly acquainted with her, we can see her and follow her movements, but she is a fable for all that. The poets and painters have made the form of the mermaid not one whit less clear and distinct for us than the figure of a living woman. If any of us were to see a painting of a mermaid with scales upon her neck or with feet, he would resent it and laugh at it as an inaccuracy, just as if he saw some gross anatomical blunder in a picture of a man or woman. Mr. Froude has created a Mary Stuart as art and legend have created a mermaid. He has made her one of the most imposing figures in our modern history, to which indeed she is an important addition. His Queen Elizabeth is almost equally remarkable as a work of art. His Henry VIII stands not quite so high, and far lower comes his Caesar, which is absurdly untrue as a portrait, and is not strong enough as a romantic picture. Mr. Froude's personal integrity and candour are constantly coming into contradiction with his artistic temptation. But the portrait goes on all the same. He is too honest and candid to conceal or pervert any fact that he knows. He tells everything frankly, but continues his picture in his own way. It may be that some rather darksome vices suddenly prove their existence in the character of the person whom Mr. Froude had chosen to illustrate the brightness and glory of human nature. Mr. Froude is not abashed. He deliberately states the facts, shows how in his or in that instance truth did tell shocking lies, mercy ordered several massacres, and virtue fell into the ways of Messalina. But he still maintains that his pictures are portraits of truth, mercy, and virtue. A lover of art, according to a story in the memoirs of Canova, was so struck with admiration of that sculptor's Venus that he begged to be allowed to see the model. The artist gratified him, but so far from beholding a very goddess of beauty in the flesh, he only saw a well-made, rather coarse-looking woman. The sculptor, seeing his disappointment, explained to him that the hand and eye of the artist, as they work, can gradually and almost imperceptibly change the model from that which it is in the flesh to that which it ought to be in the marble. This is the process which is always going on with Mr. Froude whenever he is at work upon some model in which, for love or hate, he takes unusual interest. Therefore, the historian is constantly involving himself in a welter of inconsistencies and errors. Mr. Froude's errors go far to justify the dull and literal old historians of the school of Dryasdust, who, if they never quickened an event into life, never, on the other hand, deluded the mind with phantoms. The chroniclers of mere facts and dates, the old almanac makers, are weary creatures, but one finds it hard to condemn them to mere contempt when he sees how the vivid genius of a man like Mr. Froude can lead him astray. Mr. Froude's finest artistic gift becomes his greatest defect for the special work he undertakes to do. A scholar, a man of high imagination, a man likewise of patient labour, he is above all things a romantic portrait painter, and the spell by which his works allure us is the spell of the magician, not the calm power of the teacher. End of section 48. Section 49 of A History of Our Own Times, Volume 4 by Justin McCarthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 67, The Literature of the Reign, Second Survey, Part 3. Mr. Buckle's History of Civilization in England created a sensation hardly less than that produced by Mr. Darwin's Origin of Species. Indeed, for a time, the interest it created was keener and more widely diffused. Mr. Buckle undertook to prove 4 great principles which he contended were essential to the understanding of history. First, that the progress of nations depends upon the success with which the laws of phenomena are investigated, and the extent to which knowledge of these laws is diffused. Second, that before any such investigation can proceed, a spirit of skepticism must arise, which at first aiding the investigation is afterwards aided by it. Third, that the results of this investigation tend to increase the influence of intellectual truths and to diminish, not absolutely but relatively, the influence of moral truths, which latter are more stationary than intellectual truths and receive fewer additions. Fourth, that the great enemy of this progressive investigation and subsequently of human civilization is the protective spirit in which governments undertake to watch over men and direct them what to do, and in which churches and teachers prescribe for them what they are to believe. Now it is plain that on the decision of the first point rested the whole issue between Mr. Buckle and his opponents. If the progress of civilization depended upon the discovery and right appreciation of phenomena, then the basis of the science of history would be settled beyond dispute. History would then take its ordered place like any of the physical sciences. But it was on this very first point that the struggle had to be made in which, as it seems to us, Mr. Buckle's endeavour broke down. He laboured to establish nothing less than the fact that all the movements of history, and indeed of human life through all its processes, are regulated by fixed physical laws as certain as those which rule the motions of the waves and the changes of the weather, and of which we could arrive at a sound and trustworthy knowledge if we were content to study their phenomena as we do the phenomena of the sea and the skies. Of course, this was not an idea which occurred for the first time to Mr. Buckle. It is an idea which has always been more or less clearly in the minds of some men. It belongs to that principle which Comte laid down when he endeavoured to explain the development of human history. It was more than once put into the form of a principle by Goethe, and had been described more distinctly still by Lessing. But men like Goethe and Lessing suggested it rather as a probability than endeavoured to define it as an actual law. Mr. Buckle set about establishing it as the law of human life by illustration, argument, and evidence drawn from the actual facts of history and of nature. He brought to his task a vast amount of more or less arranged information, an ardent spirit full of faith in his own theory, and a power of self-will and self-complacency which enabled him to accept as certain and settled every dogma on which he had personally made up his mind. The history of civilization was never finished. The author's early death brought the task to a close. It remains a great effort, a monument of courage, energy, and labour. Perhaps, indeed, it might not inaptly be described as a ruin. Mr. Buckle had attempted a task beyond the compass of one man's capacity and of men's combined knowledge thus far. He tried to build a literary Tower of Babel, by means of which man might reach the skies and look down complacently on the mechanical movements of planets, races, and generations beneath. He died at the age of 40, lamenting almost with his latest breath that he had to leave his work unfinished, and still believing that life, mere life, was all he needed to make it complete. Mr. Kinglake's still unfinished history of the Crimean War is full of brilliant description and of keen penetrating thought. It shows many gleams of the poetic, and it has some of the brightest and bitterest satirical passages in the literature of our time. The chapters in which Mr. Kinglake goes out of his way to describe the career, the character, and the companions of Emperor Napoleon III cut like corrosive acid. Mr. Kinglake found his mind filled with detestation of Louis Napoleon and his companions. He invented for himself the theory that the Crimean War arose only out of Louis Napoleon's peculiar position and his anxiety to become recognized among the great sovereigns of Europe. The invention of this theory gave him an excuse for lavishing so much labor of love and hate on chapters which must always remain a masterpiece of remorseless satire. They hardly pretend to be always just in their estimates of men, but no one rates them according to their justice or their injustice. They are read for their style and nothing more. Perhaps it would not be altogether unjust to say much the same of the history as far as it has gone. It is brilliant, it is powerful, it is full of thrilling passages, but it remains, after all, the historical romance rather than history. Moreover, it is a good deal too long. The Crimean War came after a generation of peace, and to many Englishmen it seemed almost as if there never had been such a war before or would be again. Mr. Kinglake set about his great book with something like the same estimation of the historical importance and proportions of the war. Even already the perspective of events is beginning to come fairly out, and it seems as if the Crimean campaign hardly needed the huge historical monument at which Mr. Kinglake is still at work. Mr. Lecky has probably more of the philosophic mind than any of his contemporaries. He has treated history on a large scale and in the philosophical spirit. He has taken a wide and liberal survey of the progress of thought and of morals as a whole, and then has brought the knowledge and observation thus acquired to the practical purpose of illustrating certain passages of history and periods of human development. His History of England in the 18th century is not more remarkable thus far for the closeness and fullness of its details than for its breadth of view and its calmness of judgment. Mr. Lecky is always the historian and never the partisan. His works grow on the reader. They do not turn upon him all at once a sudden glare like the flash of a revolving light, but they fill the mind gradually with a sense of their justice and their philosophic thought, and the clear calmness of their historical observation. Dean Stanley, the pupil and biographer of Dr. Arnold, has made some of the most valuable contributions to ecclesiastical history which our time possesses. His Historical Memorials of Westminster Abbey fascinates the reader by its beauty of style and by the evidences of the loving care with which the author has approached his subject. Mr. John Morley has produced monographs of Burke, of Rousseau, and of Voltaire, which are original in their very form, and which have made a distinct mark on the literature of their day. There are many essayists in history, biography, and the criticism of art and letters who well deserve to be named in a survey of the literature of our time, but whom we are compelled to pass over. Space would hardly allow of our even classing them in schools, as, for example, the positivists, the neo-pagans, the aesthetics, the agnostics, the satirists, and all the rest. In an age of prodigious literary activity, the essayists of various schools have certainly not been the least active and productive. The poets, however, outnumber them by far. We have had no great poet in these later days, but the number of our singers is prodigious. A great meeting of poets could be got up in London alone. Many really fine poems are the almost unnoticed result of this multitudinous labour. Sir Walter Scott once said, with good-humoured modesty, that he had taught many ladies and gentlemen to write romances as well or nearly as well as he could himself. Of the poetic voices which literally fill the air around us, the majority must be those of mere mocking-birds, and yet it is not always easy to distinguish between the original notes and the imitation. The highest reach attained among the poets of this later day is assuredly that of Mr. Swinburne. His first volume of poems containing the Queen Mother and Rosamond, published in 1861, made no mark whatever, but his Atalanta in Calydon, which appeared in 1865, startled the world. The mere boldness of the return to the subjects and the very forms of Greek drama would have commanded attention, but there was something much more commanding in the genuine originality with which the poet breathed new life into the antique forms. Mr. Swinburne's mastery of melodious phrase and verse astonished even the age acquainted with the musical richness and softness of Tennyson's lines, and Mr. Swinburne had a vibrating strength in his verse such as the poet laureate never tried to have. Mr. Swinburne decidedly shot an arrow higher into the air than any of his fellows in these later days, but he only shot one arrow. To vary the illustration, we must say that the jet from his poetic source soared higher than that of any of his rivals, but it was only one thin, narrow stream, and not a full fountain sending its spray and its waters broadly in the sun. His poetic ideas are very few. Even his vocabulary is not liberal. Words as well as ideas are soon exhausted. Even the greatest admirer becomes conscious of a sense of monotony as he listens again and again to the same cry of rebellion against established usage, the same hysterical appeal to lawlessness in passion and in art, poured forth in the same phraseology and with the same alliteration. Mr. Morris, the author of Jason and the Earthly Paradise, is a poet of a milder and purer strain. Nothing can be more beautiful, tender, and melancholy than some of his sweet, pathetic stories. Mr. Morris has been compared to Chaucer, but he is at the best a Chaucer without strength and without humour. He has such storyteller's power as one might suppose suited to absorb the evening hours of some lady of medieval days. She would have loved Mr. Morris's beautiful tales of love and truth and constancy and separation, tales which, to quote the poet's own words, would make her sweet eyes wet at the least sometimes, at least when heaven and earth on some fair eve had grown too fair for mirth. But the broad strength of Chaucer, the animal spirits, the ringing laughter, the occasional fierceness of emotion, the pain and the passion are not to be found in Mr. Morris's exquisite and gentle verse. Mr. Dante G. Rossetti has written some sonnets which are probably entitled to rank with the best of their kind at any time, and one or two ballads of fierce, impassioned style, which seem as if they came straight from the heart of the old northern ballad world. Miss Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market is almost perfect in its way. Miss Jean Ingelow has written some tender and pathetic poems. Mr. Aubrey de Vere is a true poet, and one of a family of poets. Mr. Robert Buchanan at one time gave promise of taking a high rank among modern poets. Assuredly he has not fulfilled all the hopes of his first days, but he must always stand well among the singers who only claim to form the second order of the poets of our time. The Spanish Gypsy and other productions in verse by the novelist George Eliot are the clever attempts of a woman of genius, who is not a poet, to write poetry. The poetry of these days may boast of having produced a distinct school, which has contrived to inoculate not only literature, but art, architecture, ornament, dress, and social life generally with its influence. It is possible that long after the world may have ceased to read even the best writers of the school itself will live curiously in memory, with its mannerisms, its affectations, its absurdities, imitations, and quackeries, and at the same time with its genuine beauty and high spiritual aspirations. The Précieuses, it is to be remembered, are not always ridiculous. They were not ridiculous at all to begin with. They were ladies of intellect and true artistic feeling. It was only when imitation and insincerity set in, when sentiment took the place of emotion, when mannerisms tried to pass itself off as originality, that the heroines of Molière's immortal comedy could have been lifelike figures even in caricature. So it is with the pre-Raphaelite school, as a certain group of poets and painters came to be fantastically designated. Pre-Raphaelitism was in the beginning a vigorous protest in favour of truth in nature and art, of open eyes and faithful observation in artistic critics, students, and everyone else, as against conventionalities and prettinesses and unrealities of all kinds. Mr. Ruskin was the prophet of the new school. Mr. Dante Rossetti, Mr. Holman Hunt, Mr. Madox Brown, and Mr. Millais were its practical expounders in art. A great controversy sprang up, and England divided itself into two schools. No impartial person can deny that Mr. Ruskin and the pre-Raphaelites did great good, and that much of their influence and example was decidedly healthy. But pre-Raphaelitism became a very different thing in later years, when it professed to invade all arts and to establish itself in all the decorative business of life, from the ornamentation of a cathedral to the fringe of a dress. Lately it has become a mere affectation, an artistic whim. It has got mixed up with aestheticism, neo-paganism, and other such fantasies. The typical pre-Raphaelite of the school's later development is, however, a figure not unworthy of description. The typical pre-Raphaelite believed Mr. Dante Rossetti and Mr. Burne-Jones to be the greatest artists of the ancient or modern world. If one spoke to him of contemporary English poetry, he assumed that there was only question of Mr. Rossetti, Mr. Swinburne, or Mr. Morris. In modern French literature he admired Victor Hugo, Baudelaire, and one or two others newer to song, and of whom the outer world had yet heard little. Among the writers of older France he was chiefly concerned about François Villon. He was an enthusiastic admirer of the paintings of the late Henri Regnault. Probably he spoke of France as our France. He was angry with the Germans for having vexed our France. He professed faith in the philosophy of Schopenhauer and the music of Wagner, and he was greatly touched by Chopin. He gave himself out as familiar with the Greek poets and was wild in his admiration of Sappho. He made for himself a sort of religion out of wallpaper, old teapots, and fans. He thought to order, and yet above all things piqued himself on his originality. He and his comrades received their opinions as Charlemagne's converts did their Christianity, in platoons. He became quite a distinct figure in the literary world of our time, and he positively called into existence a whole school of satirists in fiction, verse, and drawing, to make fun of his follies, whimsicalities, and affectations. End of section 49. Section 50 of A History of Our Own Times, Volume 4, by Justin McCarthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 67, The Literature of the Reign, Second Survey, Part 4. The fiction of this second period has one really great name and one only. The author of Adam Bede and The Mill on the Floss stands on a literary level with Dickens and Thackeray and Charlotte Bronte. George Eliot, as this author chooses to call herself, is undoubtedly a great writer merely as a writer. Her literary career began as a translator and an essayist. Her tastes seemed then to lead her wholly into the somewhat barren fields where German metaphysics endeavour to come to the relief or the confusion of German theology. She became a contributor to the Westminster Review. Then she became its assistant editor, and worked assiduously for it under the direction of Dr. John Chapman, the editor. She had mastered many sciences as well as literatures. Probably no other novel writer, since novel writing became a business, ever possessed anything like her scientific knowledge. Unfortunately, her scientific knowledge over-informed her later novels and made them oppressive to readers who longed for the early freshness of Adam Bede. George Eliot does not seem to have found out, until she had passed what is conventionally regarded as the age of romance, that she had in her, high above all other gifts, the faculty of the novelist. When an author who is not very young makes a great hit at last, we soon begin to learn that he had already made many attempts in the same direction, and his publishers find an eager demand for the stories and sketches which, when they first appeared, utterly failed to attract attention. But it does not seem that Miss Marian Evans, as she then was, ever published anything in the way of fiction previous to the series of sketches which appeared in Blackwood's magazine and were called Scenes of Clerical Life. These sketches attracted considerable attention and were much admired, but not many people probably saw in them the capacity which produced Adam Bede and Romola. With the publication of Adam Bede came a complete triumph. The author was elevated at once, and by acclamation, to the highest rank among living novelists. In one of the first numbers of the Cornhill magazine, Thackeray, in a gossiping paragraph about novelists of the day, whom he mentioned alphabetically and by their initials, spoke of E as a star of the first magnitude just risen on the horizon. Nothing is much rarer than the union of the scientific and the literary or artistic temperaments. So rare is it that the exceptional, the almost solitary instance of Goethe comes up at once, distinct and striking to the mind. English novelists are even less likely to have anything of a scientific taste than French or German. Dickens knew nothing of science, and had indeed as little knowledge of any kind, save that which is derived from observation, as any respectable Englishman could well have. Thackeray was a man of varied reading, versed in the lighter literature of several languages, and strongly imbued with artistic tastes. But he had no care for science, and knew of it only what everyone has to learn at school. Lord Lytton's science was a mere sham. Charlotte Bronte was genius in ignorance. George Eliot is genius in culture. Had she never written a page of fiction, she must have been regarded with admiration by all who knew her as a woman of deep thought and of a varied knowledge such as men complacently believe to be the possession only of men. It was not this, however, which made her a great novelist. Her eyes were not turned inwards or kept down in metaphysical contemplation. She studied the living world around her. She had an eye for external things keen almost as that of Dickens or Balzac. George Eliot is the only novelist who can paint such English people as the Poysers and the Tullivers just as they are. She looks into the very souls of such people. She tracks out their slow, peculiar mental processes. She reproduces them fresh and firm from very life. Mere realism, mere photographing, even from the life, is not in art a great triumph. But George Eliot can make her dullest people interesting and dramatically effective. She can paint two dull people with quite different ways of dullness, a dull man and a dull woman, for example, and the reader is astonished to find how utterly distinct the two kinds of stupidity are, and how intensely amusing both can be made. There are two pedantic, pompous, dull advocates in Mr. Browning's The Ring and the Book. How distinct they are, how different, how unlike, and how true are the two portraits. But then it must be owned that the poet sometimes allows his pedants to be as tiresome as they would be in real life if each successively held a weary listener by the button. George Eliot is not guilty of any such artistic fault. No one wants to be rid of Mrs. Poyser or Aunt Glegg or the prattling Florentines in Romola. There never was or could be a Mark Tapley or a Sam Weller. We put up with these impossibilities and delight in them because they are so amusing and so full of fantastic humour. But Mrs. Poyser lives, and everyone knows an Aunt Glegg, and poor Mrs. Tulliver's cares and hopes and little fears and pitiful reasonings are animating hundreds of Mrs. Tullivers all over England. George Eliot has infused into the novel some elements it never had before, and so thoroughly infused them that they blend with all the other materials and do not form anywhere a solid lump or mass distinguishable from the rest. There are philosophical novels, Wilhelm Meister, for example, which are weighed down and loaded with philosophy, and which the world only admires in spite of the philosophy. There are political novels, Lord Beaconsfield's, for instance, which are only intelligible to those who make politics and political personalities a study, and which viewed merely as stories would not be worth speaking about. There are novels with a great direct purpose in them, such as Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Bleak House, or Mr. Charles Reade's Hard Cash. But these, after all, are only magnificent pamphlets, splendidly illustrated diatribes. The deep philosophical thought of George Eliot's best novels quietly suffuses and illumines them everywhere. There is no sermon here, no lecture there, no solid mass interposing between this incident and that, no ponderous moral hung around the neck of this or that personage. The reader feels that he is under the spell of one who is not merely a great storyteller, but one who is also a deep thinker. Mr. Anthony Trollope carries to its utmost limit the realism begun by Thackeray. He has none of Thackeray's genius, none of his fancy or feeling, none of his genuine creative power. He can describe with minute photographic faithfulness the ways, the talk, and sometimes even the emotions of a Belgravian family, of a nobleman's country house, or the womankind of a dean in a cathedral town. He does not trouble himself with passion or deep pathos, although he has got as far as to describe very touchingly the mental pains of a pretty girl thrown over by her lover, and has suggested with some genuine power the blended emotion, half agony of sorrow, half sense of relief, experienced by an elderly clergyman on the death of a shrewish wife. It was natural that after the public had had a long succession of Mr. Trollope's novels, there should come a ready welcome for the school of fiction which was called the sensational. Of this school, Mr. Wilkie Collins headed one class, and Miss Braddon the other. Miss Braddon dealt in what we may call simple, straightforward murders and bigamies and such like material. Mr. Collins made his crimes always of an enigmatic nature, and compelled the reader to puzzle them out as if they were morbid conundrums. Mr. Trollope, however, continued to have his clientele all the time that the sensational school in its various classes or branches was flourishing and fading. Mr. Trollope's readers may have turned away for a moment to hear what became of the lady who dropped her husband down the well, or to guess at the secret of the mysterious woman in white, but they soon turned loyally back to follow the gentle fortunes of Lily Dale, and to hear what was going on in the household of Frumley Parsonage and under the stately roof of the Duke of Omnium. Mr. Charles Reade, with all his imperfections as an artist, belongs to a higher order than Mr. Trollope, who is so much more thoroughly a master of his own narrower art. Peg Woffington and Christy Johnston, the former published so long ago as 1852, seem almost perfect in their symmetry and beauty. The Cloister and the Hearth might well nigh have persuaded a reader that a new Walter Scott was about to arise on the horizon of our literature. In Mr. Reade's more recent works, however, the author began to devote himself to the illustration of some social or legal grievance calling for reform, and people came to understand that a new branch of the art of novel writing was in process of development. the special gift of which was to convert a parliamentary blue book into a work of fiction. The treatment of criminals in prison and in far-off penal settlements, the manner in which patients are dealt with in private lunatic asylums, became the main subject and backbone of the new style of novel, instead of the misunderstandings of lovers, the trials of honest poverty, or the struggles for ascendancy in the fashionable circles of Belgravia. Mr. Reed may claim the merit of standing alone in work of this kind. He can make a blue book live, and yet be a blue book still. He takes the hard and naked facts as he finds them in some newspaper or in the report of some parliamentary commission, and he so fuses them into the material whereof his romance is to be made up that it would require a chemical analysis to separate the fiction from the reality. The reader is not conscious that he is going through the boiled-down contents of a blue book. He has no aggrieved sense of being entrapped into the dry details of some harassing social question. The reality reads like romance. The romance lives like reality. No author ever indulged in a fairer piece of self-glorification than that contained in the last sentence of Put Yourself in His Place. I have taken, says Mr. Reed, a few undeniable truths out of many, and have laboured to make my readers realize those appalling facts of the day which most men know, but not one in 1,000 comprehends, and not one in 100,000 realizes, until fiction, which, whatever you may have been told to the contrary, is the highest, widest, noblest, and greatest of all the arts, comes to his aid, studies, penetrates, digests the hard facts of chronicles and blue books, and makes the dry bones live. Distinct, peculiar, and lonely is the place in fiction held by Mr. George Meredith, the author of The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, Beecham's Career, The Egoist, and other novels. Mr. Meredith has been more than once described as a prose Browning. He has indeed much of Mr. Browning's obscurity of style, not caused by any obscurity of thought, but rather by a certain perverse indifference on the part of the artist to the business of making his meaning as clear to others as it is to himself. He has a good deal of Mr. Browning's peculiar kind of grim saturnine humour, not the humour that bubbles and sparkles, the humour that makes men laugh even while it sometimes draws tears to the eyes. He lacks the novelist's first charm, the power of telling a story well. But despite these defects, he is unquestionably one of the most remarkable of all the modern novelists, short of the very greatest. There are times when the reader is inclined to wonder how, with so many great gifts, he has failed to become a great novelist. The story called Beecham's Career, which probably not one in every 1,000 novel readers has even opened, seems to us to have only narrowly missed being one of the great romances of the age of Queen Victoria. It is full of beauty, of power, of pathos. Some of its characters are so drawn that they not merely stand out as if in life before us, but they enable us to enter into all their thoughts and anticipate all their purposes. We can conjecture beforehand what they will do in a given condition of things, just as we can tell how some friend of our own is likely to act when we hear what the circumstances are under which he is called upon to take a decision. This story, too, is not overladen, as others of Mr. Meredith's unluckily are, by epigram and antithesis, by curiosities of phrase which it is difficult to follow, and conceits which rather dazzle the eyes of the reader than light up the page. If Mr. Meredith's novels were to be examined according to their intellectual worth, they would deserve and demand a much fuller analysis than has been attempted here. But in these pages we are looking at the literature of the time from the chronicler's rather than the critic's point of view. We tell that a certain soldier won a battle or statesman gained a political victory, although we may ourselves be of opinion that the victory was better deserved on the other side. In the same spirit we record the fact that Mr. Meredith has not yet succeeded in gaining that place in fiction which our own judgment of his capacity would say that he is surely well qualified to attain. Mr. Blackmore's Lorna Doone seems to us, on the whole, the best novel of the second class produced in England in our time. That is to say, we rank it distinctly below the great novels of Dickens and Thackeray and Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot, but above any novel produced by any writer short of these, and above the inferior works of these great artists themselves. Mr. William Black is the head of a school of fiction which he himself called into existence. Scottish scenery and Scottish character, alternating with certain phases of London life, are the field in which he works and in which he has no rival. He has not as yet shown himself great in passion or in pathos. The deeper emotions of the human heart, the sterner phases of human life, he has apparently not often cared to touch. But in his own province, somewhat narrow though that be, his art approaches to perfection. He can paint not merely scenery, but even atmosphere, with a delicacy and strength of touch which in themselves constitute an art. Mr. Hardy has done something of the same for certain English counties that Mr. Black has done for Scotland. He is occasionally stronger than Mr. Black, but he has not his subtle sweetness, charm, and tender grace, and he is far less equal, far less surely master of his own craft. A word must be said of the delicate porcelain of Miss Thackeray's work in fiction, her tender, gentle, womanly stories, nor should we fail to record the fact that Mrs. Crack's John Halifax Gentleman was one of the literary successes of the day. A style of novel peculiar to this age, and very unlike that of Miss Thackeray or Mrs. Crack, deserves a word of mention. That is the novel which records the lives, the rompings, the ambitions, the flirtations, and the sufferings of what we may call the roaring girl of the Victorian age. With tousled, unkept hair, disorderly dress, occasionally dirty hands, and lips bubbling over with perpetual slang, this strange young woman has bounced into fiction. She has always a true and tender heart under her somewhat uncouth appearance and manners. When she falls in love very intensely, and although she may have had all manner of flirtations, she generally clings to the one true passion, and is not uncommonly found dying of a broken heart at the end of the novel. Perhaps the one merit about this kind of fiction, when it is really honest and at its best, is that it recognizes the fact that women are not a distinct angelic order of beings, but that they have their strong passions and even their coarse desires like men. Such advantage as there may be in setting this fact plainly before the world, on the authority of writers who are women themselves, the school may claim to have. It is not a high or refined or noble or in any way commendable school of fiction, but at its best it is sincere. At its worst, and it very soon reached its worst, it may be described as insufferable. The fiction of this later period is like the poetry, inferior to that of the period which we had to consider in our former survey. It has more names, but not such great names. It would almost seem as if the present school of fiction is, to borrow a phrase from French politics, exhausting its mandate. The sensation novel has had its day, and its day was but an episode, an interruption. Realism has now well nigh done all it can. Its close details, its trivial round of common cares and ambitions, its petty trials and easy loves, seem now at last to have spent their attractive power, and to urge with their fading breath the need of some new departure for the novelist. Perhaps the one common want in the more modern novel may suggest the new source of supply. Perhaps, in order to give a fresh life to our fiction, it will have to be dipped once more in the old holy well of romance. End of section 50. Recording by Pamela Nagami, M.D., in Encino, California, in September of the year of the plague, 2020. End of a history of our own times from the accession of Queen Victoria to the general election of 1880, Volume 4, by Justin McCarthy.